Got the great pleasure now to introduce MAF, Architecture and Art. Collective was established in London in 1995. The practice works on site-specific, so similar to Christian Philipp, site-specific project, research-driven project that address the social, the spatial, and also very often economic infrastructures of the public realm. The project range from large-scale urban design strategies, landscapes, buildings, to, for example, temporary intervention. A recent project is the British Pavilion on the 12th Venice Biennale, the Barking Town Square, and also actually MAF are the winner of the 2008 European Prize for Urban Space. Today they will make a presentation called The Rehearsal, and it includes two projects. One project is actually completed, the other one has only just begun, and there is a map. A very warm welcome to MAF.
Thank you. So I offered to do a very short presentation because the temperature is about to drop. So it's going to drop once again. My thermometer tells me so. So today I'm going to talk about three garden walls. I'm going to begin with my own garden wall as a child in the 70s. That was my garden, and at the end of my garden was the long garden, and only boys were invited from the neighbourhood to play cricket in the long garden. The consequence of this meant that my entire childhood was spent trying to climb over the garden wall. And secondly, a coincidence was that the architect, Basil Spence, architect of Coventry Cathedral, did a scheme to knock down every house in my side of the road. So this early training in resistance also meant I had available to me 12 empty gardens because we were the last house standing. So, in fact, a whole none of the houses ended up being knocked down. And so I'm now going to talk about two other boundaries that in different ways, and I think this is something of MAF's practice, have been scaled. We always work to commissions, endlessly obedient to the brief, but always making unsolicited research that the client didn't actually ask for. So this is a project, part of High Street 2012, a new route between the city and the Olympic site. So MAF have been working on the attempt to make real some small legacies. This is the listed church wall, 1250, of the original St. Mary. The church isn't, the wall isn't 1250, but this is a thick little park opposite the Whitechapel Art Gallery, thick with the remains of 4 churches, so many bones that it was closed for public burial, and secular monuments. The first thing we did was to make a hole in the wall so that it's possible to slip into this garden and slip back into the street. This is a project which is complete in 7 days' time. It'll open again. And the project makes visible these multiple histories and does it in the following ways. That in many ways, London mirrors the succession that's found in ecology, the way that one species will be taken over by the next at this point of Serti. And the image on the left is one of those churches which was in that park, and is that moment when the local Jewish population was such that the church made itself available for Jewish holidays. And on the right is the same park on the 21st of February when the Mother Tongue Day is celebrated, and 3,000 people come to this same park. This was what it looked like before we started. This sort of loose arrangement of activities, which on Mondays to Fridays was taken over by one local group of young people. So the first thing we did was to try to attempt to make visible what was there, and did it with an archaeological dig with the Museum of London to make evident what lay beneath the ground. Did it with 700 adults and children, and made concrete those 3 weeks with pieces of terrazzo which sit in their own monument to those days. And here is showing how 2 of the churches, of the 4 churches that sat on the site, are made visible as the path that allows you to slip off the street, enter the garden, and go back to the street again. So in green terrazzo is the profile of one of the 19th century churches, and in white Portland stone, these fragments mark out the original white chapel which stood on this landscape. Approximations of a building which only exists in the rarest of sketches. Fragments of the pulpits, stair, and again the example of holding a client true to their original brief. All these pieces were made at the other end of the street in Stratford by the Building Crafts College, and this was how play is introduced into the park, the idea of small promontories within a landscape. From this point, you look across the park to the Shahid Minir monument. This is a monument to the Bengali martyrs language movement, 1952. Thousands of students were killed because they were protesting to make Bengali an official language. And this sits as a little 1/3 replica of a monument in Dhaka. So anyone who recognises this and had thought that it was some piece of civic public art, it wasn't. And so these are the 2, this replication. And we attempted to give it its own little world, its own little landscape to sit in, but also to try to relink, for those who are familiar with InDesign, back to Dhaka by commissioning Alpana painters who paint in rice paint a ritual which happens every 21st of February in Dhaka, and play it out again in Whitechapel. Throughout the park, to make that connection back between shrine and church, between the secular and the religious, are fragments of play which have deliberate references to the ecclesiastical. There we are. And that idea of this rhythm of replacement, of activity, but the idea equally of, instead of a melange, of making visible each of the elements of place, is the ambition of this particular garden, and you can then return back to the street to keep walking east. The second, you're looking at 5 acres of empty landscape adjacent to East Croydon Station. So on the way from Gatwick, look left as you come into the station. And if you open your little map, which you've been handed, which I meant to mention before, you'll see a photograph taken from just where this lady's having a cigarette, looking back across this site. The commission this time was to not make an exciting public route to the Olympic site, but the commission was to make perhaps Dan Graham's corporate Arcadia, because this is the site of Ruskin Square, a new office and residential development. 12 years ago, the office buildings that stood on the site were demolished, and across it can be seen the traces of turning circles and fragments of terrazzo from now unused reception areas. So that's what's going to be there. it is hoped by some. But it's been 12 years waiting. And during that time, it's been wrapped in a matte black hoarding with some large billboards that have been there for 5 years, which state, "Hello Future." And so here the act of brief obedience and disobedience was to make true the promise that this was Ruskin Square by putting some Ruskinian principles back into it. And so we're working with the developers, Stanhope, to take on Ruskin's line that life is wealth, and to ask that if you make a habitude of use in a place, how might that begin to contaminate and redirect the landscape of the future. So this sketch shows the arrangement of what we're proposing to put there. And the little black building sitting there in the corner is the Warehouse Theatre, lone activity within this territory, still putting on plays of new writing. And so the first move that we proposed was the idea of garden as restorative. And so to give the theatre, by cutting one door in the back of the theatre gets a theatre garden and bar, and so a means of livelihood. So some of the proposals were these ideas of the bringing in of the activities of Croydon itself. So cricket is played, to build structures of cricket nets. But when I came and had my pleasurable and alarming cup of tea with this man here, we said, well, maybe we'll just actually do something for the marathon, that this can be the impetus to make good promises and to sort of hold oneself to the hyperbole that architects are often guilty of making claims for their own work. And so if Muff's work is interested in this idea of the extended building, the idea that the impact that the architectural artifact has an effect beyond its building line, we thought we'd actually play it out, particularly by starting with the theatre. There's a group, Grassroots Theatre. They started in the Edinburgh Festival with Mad, Sad, and Bad, 3 plays made with the bad were prisoners, and you can imagine, or begin to imagine who Mad and Sad were. And this, their latest play, absolutely fantastic, was on a week ago. The Girls, scripts written from the first-person experiences of the 5 actors, all of whom met the director in a pupil referral unit. And here you see them on the site. And so this idea of actually showing Stanhope what we meant by the idea that life is wealth and a habitude of use was played out by taking the set of the Girls out into the landscape where it was visible from the many trains, 24 million people passing per year through East Croydon. And so the idea of making some alternative or layered possibilities for this particular garden was done for you. Thank you.